Good evening, and a very warm welcome to Day 3 of Stroud Book Festival 2020, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Caroline Sanderson and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. Now tonight, though I say it myself, we have two cracking events for you. At 8:30 p.m, we are thrilled to be welcoming award-winning Jamaican poet Kai Miller to Stroud Book Festival. Introduced by renowned Stroud poet Adam Horowitz, Kai will read from his latest poetry collection, In Nearby Bushes. It's an extraordinarily resonant work. I know that because I finished it last night. So don't miss what promises to be a wonderful event. Now we present How to Argue with a Racist with geneticist and BBC broadcaster Dr Adam Rutherford. This cogent and incredibly timely book uses science to devastating effect in dispelling prevailing myths and stereotypes around race. As a long-standing admirer of Adam's writing and broadcasting, I'm thrilled that he's agreed to join us tonight. Chairing the event for us, which by the way we present in association with Stroud Against Racism, is Sabrina Pace-Humphreys. Sabrina is a member of Stroud Against Racism and the co-founder of Black Trail Runners. She was also a vocal and powerful local campaigner during the Black Lives Matters protests earlier this year. So welcome, Adam, and over to you, Sabrina.
Thank you, Caroline. Adam, welcome to Stroud Book Festival.
It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you. It's just a shame we can't be in. It's just a shame we can't be in person.
It is. But hey, it is what it is, and we have to control the controllables. Now, I absolutely love your book. It came for me at exactly the right time. Did you have any idea when you were talking to publishers last year just what impact your book would have in this crazy year of lockdown, COVID, and the rise of Black Lives Matter?
Well, no, is the very obvious and simple answer. You know, one tries to anticipate the sort of cultural milieu, the voices that are being expressed, and just to try and get ahead of certain trends. And one of the things I say at the beginning of the book is that with the rise of nationalism and the rise of populism here and all around the world and in the States, although maybe that changed today, the vocal expression of racism in a way that I hadn't seen that I could remember, at least during my lifetime. And that was sort of combined with the fact that in the world of genetics, which is my academic area, we have made so much progress in understanding human diversity, human variation, human evolution, all the things I'm fundamentally interested in. But one of the things we didn't notice or didn't anticipate was the rise of ancestry testing kits, like companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, which are hugely popular. And although there's nothing, I don't have very many positive things to say about them. They're not fundamentally, bad products. But one thing that they have done is sort of reinforce notions of racial essentialism or cultural essentialism, meaning that our identities are locked into our genomes. And this is kind of something that we have been pushing against in genetics for many years. So that was something of a surprise. And it was a sort of perfect storm. Well, not perfect storm is the wrong way to describe it, but it was a concatenation of all of these things that we started talking about 2 years ago. I'd written about race and in a previous book in 2016. And then we thought maybe it was a good idea to produce a sort of handbook, a short, punchy, somewhat pugnacious book. I had no idea that this was going to happen, though. I don't think anyone thought that 2020 was going to happen. It's almost over.
Yeah. It was, I can remember when I came across your book, and it was, I think it was very much at the start of the rise in the Black Lives Matter protests. And we had one of our first protests in Stroud. We actually had 3 Black Lives Matter protests here on 3 consecutive days. And I was looking for something. I was looking for a way to intelligently and factually come back to those people who didn't maybe necessarily call themselves racist, but certainly had views that were long held beliefs about colour, about racial identity. What have been some of the discussions that you've had either online or on podcasts or questions by email in terms of, for example, skin colour?
Well, a lot. Yeah. Well, part of the motivation for writing this book is because, within the academy, within the world of genetics, the concept of race was deemed to be a social categorization rather than a genetic one, rather than a biological one, decades ago. I mean, this is a non-controversial area within genetics. There's barely a geneticist on Earth who regards the biological aspect of race to be a significant part of how we classify, how we talk about the races. So that's what we mean when we say race is a social construct. It's effectively an invention of social interactions, much of which was specifically designed in the sort of 17th and 18th century, the European expansionism. So anyway, this is a non-controversial idea within genetics. It's also a non-controversial idea within history, especially the history of race and the history of empire. And I'm a public science communicator. I talk about genetics in public, on the radio and on TV and in talks. And I began to notice, I mean, I'm sure it's always been there, but I only began to notice this maybe 10 years ago, that the conversations I was having in public were fundamentally different from the conversations I'm having within the walls of the academy, within genetics, and so that's on me, as a public communicator of genetics or of science more broadly. If what we think is true amongst academic professionals and scientists is not what the majority of people, is not what a large proportion of people think outside of the walls, the walls of the academy, then we have failed as a community, and I have failed as an individual to accurately convey what we think. We see the same in climate change and various aspects of science, but this is an important part of our social interaction. There were specific incidences which I thought were fascinating and sort of informative. I was chairing a talk at the Royal Institution, one of the great seats of science in central London. And we were talking about race, and we were talking about genetics and human evolution. There was a couple of geneticists on the panel, and someone from the audience asked this question. He put his hand up and said, "I've heard that black people have a different bone in their knees that makes them run faster." Now, right. Now, in situations like that, I was thinking that there's many ways to react to this. And, surprise, shock, that's crazy would be one. But actually, it was, I think, well, I don't know how I reacted at the time, but on reflection, here I am thinking, people think this, right? There are real people out there who have these kinds of views. Now, they may not describe themselves as white supremacists or as actual racists, but that's an absurd thing to say. I think you touched on it then, when one of the main objectives of the book is to address those sorts of stereotypes that, okay, so that one is pretty obscure. I don't think many people think that. But, millions of people think that black people can't swim because their bones are denser and therefore they sink. I've got black friends who think that. And more obvious sort of data sets, like the fact there hasn't been a white man in the final of the 100 meters sprint in the Olympics since 1980, seems like, superficially, it seems like, well, is that not a good data set on which to base the idea that people descended from the enslaved in the Americas are better at sprinting genetically? And there's a subsequent argument to support that, which is that this may have been as a result of selection through breeding, slave trade breeding programs, which explains why there hasn't been a white man in the Olympics finals of the 100 meters for the last 40 years. And you know, sometimes we call this positive attribute racism because everyone wants to be faster, being sporty, being athletic. These are things that everyone wants. Part of the aim of the book is to get underneath the skin of these sorts of ideas and say, well, A, is that true? B, is that a decent data set on which to base this stereotype? And C, does it matter? Right? And the answer to those questions, you know, let's not go into the details now because it gets, you know, technical and historical. But the answer is, well, A, it's a terrible data set. It consists of 58 men who are already selected for being sprinters, not for being black sprinters, for being sprinters. Are they genetically predisposed to being good at sprinting? Well, yes, of course, or else they wouldn't be in the 100 meters final. Is that genetic predisposition unique to black people in America or black people from the west coast of Africa from whom the enslaved are descended, or black people altogether? The answer is a categorical, absolute no. Not whatsoever. And then the third thing is, does it matter? Well, that's where it gets interesting from a historical point of view, because what we actually find is that if you look at the roots of racism associated with the roots of colonialism and European expansion, in this example, the downplaying of of the intelligence of people from Africa, particularly within the countries of that were targeted for the slave trade, the downplaying of intelligence and the elevation of the physicality of people that would be enslaved is fundamental to the othering and the dehumanization which justifies the enslavement of these people. What we see is, so for example, in sport, a survey done a couple of years ago showed that, sorry, this is the longest answer in history. A survey a couple of years ago showed that in 70% of cases where the media, where sports commentators were talking about black athletes, they referred to their physicality or their ancestry. And in 70% of cases where white elite athletes were being referred to, they referred to their hard work and their intelligence. Now, these things are data which just say these cultural stereotypes are baked into our culture. They are deep rooted within British and Western culture, born of slavery. So the book is trying to address some of those things. So when you say, you know, well, black people are better at sprinting or better at dancing, you have to question, A, is that real? Well, yeah, I mean, the dancing thing, maybe that's that's a joke. That's a joke. I'm playing my own game. But the sprinting thing is, you haven't seen me dance. I mean, I do talk about music in the book, and you know, the notion that again, positive stereotype that black people have natural rhythm, right? Which you think, well, that's a cool thing. Everyone wants to have good rhythm. And then you look at what that actually means and how it is used historically to repress certain groups of people. How the data doesn't make sense whatsoever. So, you know, you could historically, the best jazz musicians have been African American or of African descent. The best hip hop artists are black, and yet there's an almost total absence of black people from elite orchestras, from classical music composition, soloists, and so you think, well, hold on a minute. Is hip hop, is jazz so fundamentally different in musical form that it is actually racially segregated by biological means? To which the answer is, well, of course not. You'd have to be a crazy person to think that, and yet people do think that.
That's such a the way that you've expressed that is touched on so many different things for me. I mean, where you talk about, and I know within the book you go deeper into, you know, this belief of black people not being able to swim because their bones are denser and therefore their buoyancy in the water is going to be affected. And you talk about, you strip that back and talk about, actually, you know, when you look at it, it's about the socioeconomic reasons that black people in America, you talk about as a case in point, with, you know, the financial aspect of swimming lessons, where, you know, pools have been built historically in white neighborhoods. But actually, what really touched me when I was reading the book was you translate that to actually the amount of the percentage, as you've alluded to before, of American men and women that currently can't swim, and how that actually translates to mortality figures. Is it between children between? You could probably explain it a little bit better than me.
Yeah, I sort of make when I talk about this in lectures, I'm not making light of it because the punchline is horrific,
Yeah.
but it is, you know, this notion that black people have denser bones and therefore reduced buoyancy, and that accounts for the fact that the numbers are approximately 70% of African Americans don't swim. We don't know what the numbers are in the UK, but we think they're roughly similar. And that is accounted for by this sort of biological buoyancy factor, right? When actually, as you've just said, when you list, when surveys are done and you list the reasons why the majority of African Americans don't swim, all of them are socioeconomic. So they're extracurricular swim lessons cost money. As you said, after 64, after segregation has ended in the States, most swimming pools are built in white areas. No role models. You know, there have been 2 black people in the finals of the sprint or the short distance swimming races in the history of the Olympics. Parents who don't swim. But the first one, and this is the bit that I think is sort of, it is funny because it's absurd. The single most significant reason that accounts for the majority of non-swimmers amongst African Americans is not being taught how to swim, right? People don't swim. We're not fish, right? The only way people swim is if you're taught how to swim. And so you go through this ridiculous process that people do a lot, which is to claw towards science, to give answers to things which are actually easily more answerable by socioeconomic factors, because they're more difficult questions to address because we know how to fix them. Whereas we reach towards the science and say, oh, it's a big mystery. It may be something to do with osteoporosis or bone density. No, it's not. It's to do with teaching people how to swim. Now, the horrific punchline to this is the death rate from drowning of children between the ages of 7 and 14 in America is 3 times higher than it is for white children. So this is structural racism, and it is literally lethal, right? So there's a stereotype behind it where we say, you know, you're never going to be a great swimmer because your bones are more dense, and therefore you're just never going to be a good swimmer because it's biological. Well, that's bullshit, right? It is a fixable thing, and it's literally lethal. Oh, I got quite heated there. Sorry about that.
I like it. I like these conversations. It's passion is what it is. I mean, as I say, it really touched on me being a mother of 4 and a grandmother of 2, and actively, you know, from having experienced that kind of racist trope in my life. And, you know, one example was when I went to a athletics club as a young girl, and because I couldn't sprint, they kind of said that they didn't know what to do with me, because if you can't sprint, being a little mixed race, racialized as black girl, then what use are you to us? And those kind of things, you know, still, I know that they still happen. You know, I hear those kind of tropes being used in those ways. But again, within the book, you talk about, you know, if it was true that, you know, from a black person's perspective, you know, you talk about fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers and power and strength and endurance. Being an endurance runner myself, you know, I look at the likes of Eliud Kipchoge and kind of bow down to people like him, and kind of we say to ourselves, oh, I could never be like that. And I think you historically, you kind of convince yourself through what you've heard that there is something about those runners that makes them superior, and it can't just be that they work hard.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And you know, your experience there, I hear a lot of stories like that, and it's just kind of heartbreaking. I think sport is really important in this conversation. I had to not persuade, but my editors were less keen on this as an idea because Jenny's not that into sport, and so there was I saying I want to write 10,000 words on sport and race, and she was like, okay, well, I am into I think it's important because even if you're not into sport, this is an area where we see human variation in terms of people from around the world, and we see people at the extremes of ability. And even if you're not into sport, I bet the least sport interested person could still name sports people, British sports people, who have helped, Linford Christie, others. It's Friday night, right? But the point being, and this I think is important. This is why I want the book to be regarded, scientifically honest, whilst not shying away from the fact that there are real world and political implications for being scientifically honest. People are not born the same, right? There is natural variation between people and between groups of people and between populations of people. And that is a non-controversial thing to say. I think sometimes when I have these conversations broadly, I think there is a amongst well-intentioned people, there's a sort of tendency to take a more blank slatist view that we're all born the same and it's only socioeconomic factors that change the outcomes of our lives. I don't think that's true. The fact that, as you say, the Ethiopian and Kenyan runners have dominated long distance endurance running for so long, that is not purely socioeconomic. They do have a genetic basis which gives them advantage in long distance running. Is it unique to East Africans? No, it's not. And that's the point. We talk about black people, we talk about people from Africa. Well, we know that there is more genetic diversity within Africa than the rest of the world put together. What that means in a practical way is that actually someone from Ethiopia and someone from Rwanda are more genetically different from each other than either one of them is to anyone else on the rest of the planet. So you say, someone from West Africa who is the ancestor of, I don't know, Donovan Bailey or Michael Johnson or a sprint runner or Usain Bolt, right? Who has a high proportion of genetically determined fast twitch muscles and therefore predisposes his descendants or her descendants to being good at explosive energy sports, right? That is a definite factor in being successful as a short distance runner or as a sport associated with explosive energy. Conversely, the descendants or the ancestors of people in the highlands in Ethiopia and Kenya and the Rift Valley who have a genetic predisposition for adaptive reasons because they're at altitude towards endurance sports, that is a genetic thing. The question is it exclusive to these people? And the answer is no, right? So people are different and those differences geographically locate, but are they essential? Are they unique to those people? In every case, I'm unaware of a single case about any characteristic, any trait, physical, behavioral, sporting, whatever, that is racially specific in the way that we talk about race. And when I say I'm unaware of them, I say that in arguments with racists because they then challenge and I knock them down. What I mean by I'm unaware of them is that they don't exist.
Yeah. I think that's really for me that was a really important part of the book, that you explain it so clearly, and it's been something I'm sure people watching and listening today have experienced in terms of watching the Olympics and seeing, an all black 100-meter final and saying, oh, well, it's because they're from such and such. So that was you explained that really well. Thank you. What I want to go on to, because I could talk to you about sport and right all night, because I love my athletics, I love running. I'm all about encouraging more black people onto the trails, UK, around the world, because there's a real lack of representation there. Again, as you've alluded to, you can't be who you can't see. So how are black people supposed to think that they can go and run on trails in mountains if they don't see other black people doing it? But one thing that I wanted to speak to you about that, again, I really loved in the book was going back to like the ancestry, the 23andMe type websites, and how racists or I would say, yeah, kind of more hardy racists are using that kind of genetic kind of DNA data for their own, frankly, frankly pathetic, I would say, purposes, and the rise in that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, like, I think I love the way you're talking to me about this, because this is kind of the way I think about the structure of the book and the structure of talking about racism with the science, because I think the more important battlegrounds are racial stereotypes and people who are non-racist. But it is impossible to talk about this and talk about genetics without talking about white supremacists as well. These are not rational people; they are hate-filled people. But there is an obsession amongst white supremacists about, inherently obsessed with the concept of white purity, because white supremacy has no function unless purity can be demonstrated. Unfortunately, for the white supremacists, genetics has shown unequivocally that the concept of racial purity is just non-existent. It is a fundamental. It's just not a concept which is reflected by genetic or family or genealogical or history in any way, and yet they do these types of tests in order to demonstrate racial superiority, and think that the tests come back and say, oh yeah, I'm pure white or I'm pure Aryan. One of the things, so I spend quite a lot of time in white supremacist forums online, which I do not advise people to do. I do it so that you don't have to do it, because they're horrible, horrible places. In the book, I describe a tiny shaft of light that you see in these hateful places, which is when self-confessed white supremacists and racists do these tests and discover that they have non-Aryan or non-Northwestern European ancestry, or specifically ancestry from people that they hate, in their recent past, and they fall apart. I find it quite amusing that they have absolute breakdowns when discovering these types of things. But I and others and academically have catalogued some of the responses, and they say things like this. Well, the most common response is, try a different company. You use 23andMe, try a different company, you might get a different result, which is actually not that scientifically illiterate. The second most popular response is, 23andMe is run by Jews, so you should try a different company for a different response. The third most popular one is, 23andMe is run by Jews who deliberately plant racial false information in their databases to sow racial disharmony. Try another company for a different response. And then I pick out one example, so it is only one, but I think it's illustrative. One example that we came across was, a guy had identified that he had Jewish ancestors within the last 50 to 100 years, but was a neo-Nazi. And the response was, look in the mirror. If you see a Jew, then you're a Jew, and if you don't, you're okay. And I thought, well, that's nuts. Because if you can just look in the mirror and decide what your ancestry is, then why are you doing the test?
Yeah. Why go to the financial and time hassle of doing the test?
Yeah, I know. I mean, but then it's indicative, it's illustrative of the fact that these are not people that can be reasoned with. They're not rational. It's not. This is, the title of the book is How to Argue with a Racist, and a lot of people since it came out have said, how do you argue with a racist? And part of the answer to that is, well, I'm not sure there is a point. There's the old Jonathan Swift maxim, which I will modernize because I can't remember the elegant 18th century way he wrote it off the top of my head. But it's that you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And I think, alas, that is true. This is kind of why I think it's more important to be talking to people who are friends or family or, non-racists, or people who don't think they're racist, but inadvertently, through cultural baggage, express racist views about sport, about music, about intelligence, those things that are just baked into our culture. Because that is where you make change. It's through, I think, through moderates and progressives and people who don't want to be hate-filled shitbags.
Great term. I like that.
Sorry, people of Stroud. Today has been a day where we've seen the deposing of a hate-filled shitbag on the biggest stage in the world, and I think it's well, it's better than it was yesterday, right?
Adam, yeah, we're sharing the same views there. What I want to touch upon again is simply because it's been something that in my lived experience has maybe stopped me from achieving from an academic point of view that which I wanted to believe I could, and that's IQ. That is kind of intelligence, and kind of again the kind of trope being where we live in Stroud, there are a couple of grammar schools, and you have to do different tests to get in, etc. And lots of money, lots of people pay for tutoring, etc. But there's this feeling that, oh well, there's a high percentage of a certain race that are getting into these schools, and therefore my child kind of can't compete with that because it's inherent within their race that they're just going to do better. How do what would you say to people that are of that thought?
Yes. Well, I don't know. Read the book, maybe. Yeah, I mean, this is the hardest subject there is, I think, in the whole of science. The combination of race, which is pretty controversial in terms of genetics, with intelligence and the heritability of intelligence, which is pretty controversial and pretty tricky. So it kind of relates in one way. The basis to the answer to this question is that it sort of relates to what we were talking about a minute ago, that there are differences between people and there are differences between populations. Intelligence, by whatever metric, I'll pack that in just a second, but intelligence or cognitive abilities by whatever metric is heavily influenced by genetics, right? Which means that there is a DNA-based component to cognitive abilities, however you measure it. There are various ways we measure it and have done for more than 100 years. IQ is one of them. Educational attainment is another. Longevity in education, there are all sorts of different metrics that have been designed carefully over the last 100 years. IQ is highly controversial for lots of reasons, and I in the book go to some efforts and some lengths to defend the concept of IQ, whilst making sure or trying to make sure that it is understood what it is. Now, it is a measure of cognitive abilities. That doesn't mean that it's not culturally biased. It doesn't mean that it isn't riven with problems. But the very fact that we've been studying IQ for more than a century means that our data is so large on it that it has plenty of value. Now, again, there's a lot to unpick within there, and I don't propose we go into the details right now because we could be talking for hours on this subject. But it is possible to have a measure without necessarily understanding what it is you're measuring, right? So this is all part of my defense of IQ as a concept. Over the years, there have been various attempts to assess nationwide IQ scores. And these are where some of these stereotypes and some of these actually racist stereotypes come from. Many of them, if not most of these countrywide IQ measurements have been generated by a small group of actual demonstrably white supremacist or racist pseudoscientists. And they created effectively a data set or a set of data which says very stark things, which there are differences, countrywide differences in IQ, and particularly in particular data sets, particularly by particular researchers who I legitimately say are racist in the book, and I stand by that, suggest that average IQs are lower in sub-Saharan Africa than they are in other parts of the world. Now, it is difficult to assess how accurate those data sets are because we do know that they are fundamentally flawed. Some of them are fundamentally dishonest. Many of them were created by racists, scientific racists. Nevertheless, and this is a hard thing to say, I do think that there is some of the best evidence we have does suggest that there are countrywide differences in average IQ scores, and that some of the lower ends are indeed in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I have to be cautious about saying that. I think that is factually correct based on the evidence that we have. But you see, the differences between a scientist and a race scientist, or a scientific a pseudo scientist, is that becomes the end of that conversation. Whereas a scientist says, well, A, do we trust that data? Let's unpick that. And B, if we get to a point where we do trust that data, then we need to work out the answer to that question. And when we begin to do that, when you begin to address those two questions next to each other, what you see, I think, and I argue in the book unequivocally, is that those disparities that you see in countrywide cognitive ability tests are not explicable for genetic reasons and are explicable by socioeconomic reasons. And that's where fundamentally mainstream genetics and 99% of geneticists disagree with the tiny fringe race pseudoscientists whose voices have been amplified by social media. But the stereotypes persist. And so, your lived experience of that, and the lived experience of all sorts, not just, British Black people or African Americans or indeed in a sort of perceived positive way, Jewish people who are perceived as being genetically cognitively superior, or the stereotypes about East Asians being better at maths. Now, if it is the case that we can legitimately say there is a population in this country, or there are a group of people whose ancestry is East Asian or whatever, and they do better on average in certain academic disciplines, and that is a real data set, the question again becomes, well, why is that? And the answer, as far as we can tell, is not genetic, but is socioeconomic. One of the things that racists like to point out is that Nigerian boys, or British boys descended from Nigerians within the last 2 generations, actually do better than at school in education than white boys or white European British boys at equivalent ages. And they use that as an example. Well, Britain can't be structurally racist because the descendants of Nigerian boys over the last couple of generations actually do better. Well, that is to be expected if socioeconomic factors are taken into account. The same is true in America, where recent Nigerian Americans actually are in a very successful socioeconomic group compared to the African Americans who are the descendants of the enslaved. Racists go, well, look, we can't have racism because Nigerians do really well. Well, the lived and shared cultural experience of those two groups is very different. Anyway, it's really hard, but I think, I'm pretty sure, based on the evidence that I understand and that I write about, that these discrepancies that may be real if we really interrogate the data are better explained by socioeconomic factors than they are by genetic ones.
Yeah, I think that comes across. And again, within the book, buy the book if you haven't already got the book. Buy the book. We've had so many questions coming in, Adam, so forgive me for kind of my eyes darting down, so I've got them in ahead of me.
Sure.
So we're going to go to some questions now. So first question is from Sunny Peart. Where is genetics going next? Will it become easier to use genetics to counter racist narrative?
Yes, I hope so. So yes. I mean, I think I'm an optimist, and I think the answer to that has to be yes, for a couple of reasons. The first is historical, right? The racial boundaries that we understand today are recent. They really only have existed since the 17th or 18th century with the construction of race alongside European expansion and colonialism. There are plenty of references to pigmentation in history before that, right down to the earliest texts we have in Western culture, which is in the Iliad. But the othering and the potential subjugation of other people is, in those cases, until the era of European expansion and plunder, is not based on pigmentation. It is more to do with, you know, religion or culture or language or other ways of hating on people you haven't met before. So what that says to me is that this is transient, right? The race as we understand it today is clearly ephemeral, and therefore it is something that we can move past. I'm not, you know, the concept of color blindness, I think, is not really necessarily a useful one. The idea that we don't see race, I think, is also not useful. Racial identities are important, you know, as a social construct. Sometimes racists say, you say it's just a social construct, as if social constructs are somehow less valid than biological interactions. You know, we have biological relationships with very few people in our lives, unless you're extraordinarily good looking. We have social interactions with everyone that we meet. You know, here's two other things that are social constructs: time and money. And I bet when it was 2 minutes to 7 and I hadn't shown up on the Skype call yet, you weren't sitting there thinking, oh, well, it's going to be fine because time is a social construct. He will arrive at whenever he feels like it, right? Or if you go to a bookshop, well, you can't go to a bookshop anymore. If you want to pay someone, you say, well, you know what? I'm not going to pay you because money isn't actually real. It's just that we agree it's real as a social agreement. Try that and see how it goes down. Human interactions, social interactions that is mostly how we interact with people. So don't come at me and say it's just a social construct and therefore it's meaningless. That is mostly how humans interact. So I do think that we are capable, because history clearly dictates this, we are capable of changing our interactions with other groups of people. I'm not sure that bigotry is ever going to end, but I don't think the bigotry based on the racial stereotypes that were born of European expansion are permanent, because they're not biological.
Thank you. Second question now from Shani Wills, who's a member of Stroud Against Racism too. Do you think scientists have a responsibility to make sure that anti-racist scientists' knowledge is taught to children? Why is that not happening?
Thank you, Shani. That's the answer to those two questions are yes. I very explicitly, I think on page 2, say I don't, there is a tendency within science to possibly shy away from the political ramifications of one's research. I think that is part of the culture of science. Sometimes you hear people saying that science is apolitical. Now, that is clearly and demonstrably incorrect. It is not true. It may be a moral aim or a sort of perfect idea of science, but as long as science is done by people, it has a political element to it. My field, which is rooted in anthropology, which is associated with European expansion, is fundamentally political and always has been and continues to be to this day. So in answer to the first part of the question, it is yes, scientists, I think, have a moral obligation to talk about the implications of their work if they work in human genetics or genetics or evolution more broadly. That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm in the process of writing a young adult version of this book.
Great. Fantastic. That actually leads really, really well on to the next question that's come in. And it's not from me because I'm here talking to you, but it is from another mother. So as a mother of mixed race children with very different outward appearances with regard to colour, the first question is, how would you nurture them to deal with the differences that they see in the racist attitudes or absence thereof they come across from adults and their peers?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I know how to answer that, because I'm mixed race as well. So and I use my own sort of mixed race heritage as an example of why genetic and cultural identifications are different things at the beginning of the book. My mother is Indo-Guyanese, and my father is from Yorkshire. But I wasn't raised by my mother. My parents split up when I was very little. I was raised by my stepmom, who I refer to as my mother, and she's from Essex, right? So I am culturally from Ipswich, and you know, I was talking to Samira Ahmed, the broadcaster, the other day, and we were talking about these sorts of things. And she said, "You pass as white," which I thought was a really funny thing to say, because you know I look like this. My mum is actually a better person to ask about this, because she's a social worker and deals with children and these types of families all the time. I think education is the answer, exposure. I think cultural normalization in all places, like you say, you know, whether it's as a trail runner or on TV, you know, I think, and I say this sort of tentatively and a little bit gently, because I'm not sure robustly I think this, but you know, it's not ideas that we're thinking about. I think positive discrimination is not a bad thing. It's not an inherently bad thing. Affirmative action, I think, is not inherently a bad thing. And I think that making people uncomfortable temporarily is part of the process of normalizing, right? So when you go, it is the responsibility of the powerful to try and change things so they become normal. So when there is a panel, you know, in a trivial way, when there is a panel of, when you get asked to be on a panel of 4 other white guys, it is your responsibility to say no to that, or to say, I will appear on this panel if there is a 50-50 gender split, and that you make some effort that it is representative of the country, the structure of the country that we actually live in, and not some fantasy version of that country. And it's, you know, all the time we see criticisms of the BBC for over-representing or supposedly over-representing different ethnic groups on TV and in our culture. And I think, well, you know, so what? The point of doing this is so that in a few years' time, it's a non-issue, right? There was a time when it was illegal to be gay. And I'm not saying that homophobia or hatred directed against people of different sexualities has vanished. But there was definitely a point when that legislation was introduced where people said, this is terrible. This is the government forcing me to behave in a particular way, to treat a group of people differently, right? This is a terrible thing. And now it's not a thing. It's not a thing at all. And I think that's how I'm happy with making people a little bit uncomfortable in order to normalize how things actually are, like how people actually are, rather than how we perceive them to be.
I love that, and it's something that in my activism work I talk a lot about, getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and how in my own life and in the lives of others that I work with, we've seen the biggest changes through having those uncomfortable conversations, or you know, just putting ourselves in situations that, yeah, it's kind of just a little bit, but actually the biggest changes can happen from that.
Right, it's easy for me to say this because I mostly identify as white, even though I'm not. Pass as white, as Samira Ahmed said. Man, I come from a middle class family, although, you know, 2 generations ago they weren't. I went to a public school. I am a part of one of the top universities in the world, and I work for the BBC. I'm ticking a lot of privilege boxes there. It's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, you know what? Everyone needs to be as enlightened as I am. I totally recognize that. I think the most important sentence that I've ever written, which I borrowed from the writer Helen Lewis, and when I asked her, when I tried to attribute it to her, she said she'd borrowed it from somewhere else, and we don't really know the origin of it, but it's such an important idea. It is that if all you've ever known is privilege, then equality feels like oppression. And I honestly think this is You know, if there's one thing that people take away from anything that I've ever done, and indeed anything that Helen's ever done, or you know, it is that sentence. It is so difficult to recognize one's own privilege. Your lived experience is different from mine for many reasons, but you know, you're a woman, you're a mixed race woman. That immediately puts you into a different category of personal experience in terms of privilege and racism and sexism than it does for me, because our lived experience is not the same. But to recognize that that is a thing, I think, is the only way that we make progress.
Absolutely. And yeah, as you say, it's up to us in our positions in order to continue to step on, as I say, to continue to step into those conversations, you know, not accepting what has been historically accepted. Now, I'm very, very aware that there are so many questions coming in, and we're kind of running close to the end.
I can do this all night. Oh, I can do this all night. I have run out of wine.
You have run out. I was just noticing you've run out of wine. Now, we live in Gloucestershire, so we're Stroud, and someone has come in and said, can Adam talk about Cheddar Man? Yeah. I think many people don't know about him. So, yeah, you talk about Cheddar Man in the book.
And this was work done by colleagues of mine at UCL. I'm looking for the book with a picture of it in, but I don't think it's on this shelf. This is I'm actually in my bedroom. That's the
your bookshelf.
That's one bookshelf, but I think it's in one of the other bookshelves. So Cheddar Man was a set of remains found in the 19s, because I can't remember. But due to recent advances in genetic technology, we've been able to extract genomes from people who've been dead for thousands, 10,000s of years, and that happened 2 or 3 years ago with Cheddar Man. The DNA extracted from these bones by colleagues of mine at UCL, and the Natural History Museum, and one of the things that was looked at was the genes associated in this guy, associated with pigmentation. And as a result of what those genes looked like, a maquette, a figure, was made, which included, obviously, the pigmentation of what they interpreted from his genetic makeup. And what came out was a blue-eyed guy with very, very dark skin, sort of equivalent to a Khoi or Khoisan or deep sub-Saharan African person, with black, curly, but not very tightly curly hair, but sort of more wavy hair. Now, this became a weird intersection of real science, media science, and racists, because a number of things happened at the same time, which were overall, I think, not a great example of how to do good science communication. The genetics indicated that it was likely that he had darker skin than anyone I can see on screen right now, and is likely to have blue eyes. The choice made by the people who made the figure, I think, gave him darker skin than could be assumed from his genetic makeup, which, and to understand that, and I've got a whole chapter 1 of the book is about pigmentation. When I talk about Cheddar Man specifically, it is incredibly hard to predict skin color based on genes on their own. You can make average predictions. Genetics is probabilistic, which means that if you say, there are 8 genes and these variants are more likely to be associated with dark skin than light skin, then you can make predictions based on those genotypes of what the phenotype would be, the genotype being what the genetics looks like and the phenotype being what the physical manifestation of those genes looks like. Anyway, internally, that's a sort of academic dispute. The wording in the paper, I think, is perfectly reasonable, and I cite it in the book. I then criticize the pigmentation of the figure, which is, I think, on display in the Natural History Museum, or I think, anyway. But racists lost their minds about this because they identified this sort of chink in the academic discussion between what the genotype said and what the phenotype looked like based on the figure, and just went, well, this is nuts. This is, you've just made a black man who was an Englishman or a Briton from 10,000 years ago, and he clearly didn't look like that. And to which my response was, oh God, this is tiresome. It is uncontroversial that the Britons before the huge population shift that happened about 4,000 years ago, where almost the entire population of the British Isles was replaced over the course of about 150 years, the people before that had dark skin. This is not controversial. This is not a problematic thing to say within science or within history. We know that. These are facts, right? The notion that Britons have always been white and you can date your ancestry back to the first Britons, it's just it's just a fiction. It's an easy fiction to sort of tie yourself into, even if you're not a racist. But if you are a racist, then they tend to be sort of robustly fixed into that. So the answer to the question is the Cheddar Man study was a great piece of science. I have some sort of high level science communications issue with how it was communicated, but not to the extent that they're either wrong or or right. But this stuff is hard. And one of the things we say in science when we teach science is, if someone is telling you what the answer is, they probably don't know what the answer is. Science is a process of finding out, and the best and most important thing that a scientist can ever say is 3 words, which is I don't know.
I think as a race, I think that a lot of the conversations, especially the uncomfortable conversations I've had over the last 6 to 9 months, if people had said, I don't know, those conversations could have actually heralded some interesting further kind of thoughts and threads.
Follow up. Right. Well, if you're a scientist, I don't know, but I do know how to find out.
Yes.
That's the process. In science, not knowing the answer or changing your mind, those are virtues. Those are the sign of a good scientist. In politics, it is somehow the opposite way around. And I think that is, that's a big problem with our politics. You turning on things is considered weakness. Scientist who changes his or her mind that means they're sciencing right.
You've just, we're almost out of time, but actually you just talked about politics, and the last question, which I would just like a quick fire answer on, is regarding the privilege that Adam's just referred to. Does Adam feel a responsibility to get involved in policy lawmaking at government level?
I think it is my duty and the duty of all scientists to accurately convey what it is that we know and how we know those things, and to use our knowledge and expertise to influence policymakers. I talk to politicians. I know MPs. I've spoken in Parliament about this, about race and other issues, and I'm happy to do those things. I think if you're asking me if I'd be a politician, I've way too many skeletons in my closet for that.
Adam, I think if you were to be a politician, I think you'd have a lot of backing. But I just personally want to thank you so much for giving up your time this evening. As I said, your book is here, it's in my handbag, and I am overjoyed to hear that you are writing a version for teens, for younger minds, because I think it really is a fantastic piece of work that can really help us to have those uncomfortable conversations and hopefully change a few perspectives and change a few minds along the way. So thank you so much. And I absolutely have loved this evening. And as I say, there are lots of questions. So I'm sure that Caroline is going to put different ways for people to kind of follow you on social media. to kind of ask those questions further or kind of engage with you in that way. But thank you. It's been a real
It's been
joy.
an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Like he said, I think today is a good day, isn't it?
I think it is,
isn't it?
I think it is, Adam. I think today is a good day, leading to an even better weekend, maybe.
I'm going to go and have another drink. I'm going to go and have I hope you do too. I hope you do too.
Much. That was an absolutely riveting conversation. And somebody was telling me the story of a woman who said, well, what's the point of book festivals? You should just read books. Well, that is the point of book festivals. And it is also the point of reading books. So don't forget that you can buy copies of Adam's book, How to Argue with a Racist, from our festival booksellers, Stroud Bookshop, stroudbookshop.com. Stroud Book Festival urges you to buy it from them or an independent bookshop that's local to you at this very challenging time for independent retailers. Thank you both so much again. Thank you for joining us. And please remember, coming up very soon at 8:30, you can hear poet Kai Miller introduced by Adam Horowitz. Thanks again.